So friends, what is our word in the circle here? Anyone remember?
Schema.
Schema. Do you all have schema?
Yeah.
Your schema are books that you have read. Maybe you've read them here at school or at home or in a different classroom. Your schema are books that you have read. Your schema are things that you've done. How many of you have rode a bike? How many of you have taken a vacation? How many of you have walked to the park? How many of you have been to the zoo? Those are things that you've done. That's your schema. Places you've been. How many of you have been to a movie theater? How many of you have been on a car ride to some place? How many of you have been to school? How many of you have been to Grandma or Grandpa's house? That's a place that you've been. That's your schema. Your schema is also experiences that make up you. Angel's done something different than Caden's done. Rachel's done something different than Gabby. It's stuff that they know that makes up you. All right? So your schema are books you've read, things you've done, places you've been to, and things that make up who you are. Okay? So the definition of schema means thinking about what you already know. It's your background knowledge. You have schema, and you're experts in it. Schema is what you already know, okay? And friends, today we're going to talk about ways to use your schema. And we're going to be making what we call text-to-text connections sometimes. That's where we connect a book to another book. But today, we're going to connect a book to yourself. Not texting on a phone, but text is another word for book. So we're going to connect the book to yourself. How many of you have ever read a book about something you've done before? Maybe you've read a book about getting a new dog and that you've gotten a new dog. Maybe you've read a book about being a good friend and you've been a good friend. Okay? So today we're going to talk about what a text-to-self connection is. Did everyone make the connection sign? That means that you have a connection to the book, okay? We've done that before. But today, when you're making a connection, when you're reading, your brain's kind of talking to you inside your head. So we're going to say, what have I done in my head that I have some schema because I've done it before? And so we're going to have that conversation. And friends, we're going to read this book called The Relatives Came, all right? And as we're going to do this, I'm going to think out loud. I'm going to tell you my text-to-self connections. I'm going to tell you what I've done in this book that's also happened to me. So what's happening in this book, I've done. All right? And so I'm going to do that. But so you don't get confused with when I'm thinking in my head and when I'm reading the story. When I'm reading, I'm going to read like this. But when I'm telling you the conversation I'm having in my head about my connections, I'm going to put the book down. So you can tell that I'm reading here, but when I'm down here, I'm having a text-to-self connection. I'm having that, talking about my schema, all right? Gabby, do you have a question?
But what if we are raising our hand? Is it okay if we get in the way of the camera?
Oh, just put your hand down, okay? All right. So our first one's called The Relatives Came. I have some schema about the relatives came. You know what? I've had my relatives come to my house, and they've stayed with me. So I'm wondering if that's what's going to happen here. So let's take a look here.
What's relatives?
Karen, I'm going to have you go put that in the garbage and put your water bottle on your desk. It was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came up from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. I know, this reminds me of when our relatives come to the cabin in the summertime. Some of them come in a car, some of them come in a truck pulling a camper, and we all get together and have fun, just like what these relatives are doing.
What are relatives?
They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car, and they put an ice chest full of soda pop in it, and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches, and they came from Virginia. They left at 4 in the morning when it was still dark. before even the birds were awake. When I went to visit my dad this summer, we had to leave super early in the morning because he lives in the state of Wyoming, which was 12 hours away. So we packed my nieces and nephews and my sister and I, we packed all 5 kids in her minivan and all of our stuff, and we drove for 12 hours, just like the people in the book did. So when I have the book down, what am I doing? I'm talking to you about my what? Schema. When I'm reading the book, we're reading what's happening in the book. But when the book is down, I'm telling you about my schema. I'm telling you about what I'm thinking in my head. They drove all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses in different mountains. And they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia. But they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up their soda and ate up their crackers, and they traveled all those miles until finally they pulled into our yard. Oh, that was us when we got to my dad's. Oh my goodness. We pulled in and we were like, yay, let us out of here. Our legs are tired from sitting, and we stretched and we got out and we were like, hi Dad. And the kids all ran and gave Grandpa a hug, and they saw the horses. It was lots of fun. Just like what these kids are doing. They're running after the people that just arrived. Then it was hugging time. We just had hugging time that I was telling you about. That's a connection between myself and the book. Talk about hugging. Those relatives just passed us all around their car, pulling us against their wrinkled Virginia clothes, crying sometimes, and they hugged us for hours. Then it was into the house and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front door. Those relatives. And that's how my dad was. He gave me a hug, and gave my sister a hug, and he gave my 2 kids a hug, and my sister's 3 kids a hug. And then he had cowboy hats for all of them because my dad lives on a ranch. And so he gave all the kids cowboy hats. And so as they passed through and got a hug, he put a hat on their head. So kind of similar. That's my connection. And finally, after a big supper, 2 or 3 times around, until we all got a turn at the table, there was quiet talk. And there we were in 2s and 3s in the house eating. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good, since there weren't any extras. So a few squeezed in with us, and the rest slept on the floor, some with their arms thrown over the closest person, or some with their arms across one person and legs across another. It was different going to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. That's how it was with us. My dad only has 2 bedrooms in his house. And so what he did is one of my kids slept with me, and then one of them slept on the floor, and my other nephew slept on the floor, and then my sister slept in another bed, and her 2 kids were on the floor. And then my dad has a dog too, so the dog kind of slept in the middle of everything. So very much what's going on in this book, I've had happen to me when we stayed with my dad. So do I have some connections to this book and to my schema?
Yeah.
The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. They ate up all of our strawberries and melons, and they promised we couldn't eat up all the grapes or peaches when we came to Virginia. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. And that was us. We were busy. We went whitewater rafting, and we helped around the ranch, and we rode horses, and we helped make dinner. And we did some things to help my dad,
Did you
too.
play
We
football
helped
game?
kind of clean up some of the guest houses and stuff. It was fun.
I don't think
Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chest, headed back to Virginia in 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them goodbye. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds, and that felt too big and too quiet, and we fell asleep. That picture reminds me of when we had to leave. I was sad, and I kind of got teary-eyed, and my kids and my niece nieces and nephews and my sister, we hugged my dad because we only get to see him once or twice a year. And so we gave him a hug and waved goodbye, and we drove off just like their relatives drove off. And the relatives drove on all day and into the night, and they traveled along, and they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and we missed them also. And then, when they were finally home in Virginia, they crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about next summer. That was us. We got home at 1 in the morning, so it was really dark. And when we got home, I couldn't wait to crawl in my own bed and go to sleep because I was so tired from driving on the trip. Just like the relatives in this book. So, do I have some connections to this story?
Yeah.
Yes.
Every
lots
single
of them.
page. Every
And
single
so,
page.
when I have a connection to this book, and I'm talking about what's happened with my schema, do I have a connection to the book?
Yeah.
Do I have schema with this book? Raise your hand if you have schema with this book. Yeah. I just want to push stop right here.
That's a cowboy.